The other day, I was wandering through a gallery and stopped in front of a massive, centuries-old portrait of a high-ranking cardinal. The man was practically drowning in fabric, a deep, commanding crimson that seemed to vibrate against the canvas. His expression was stern, radiating an unmistakable aura of absolute, crushing power. A group of tourists next to me was whispering, and I overheard a young woman say, "It's funny how he's wearing so much pinkish red. It feels almost feminine for a guy that scary." I watched as her friends nodded in agreement. To them, seeing a man draped in bright red felt like a fashion choice or, a softening of his image. But looking at that painting, I realized we were seeing two completely different worlds. To the artist who painted it, that red wasn't pretty or romantic. It was the color of blood, of war, and of the most expensive dye on the planet. A color so aggressive it was reserved strictly for the men who ruled the world. Then I walked a few steps further to a depiction of the Virgin Mary. She was cloaked in a serene, breathtaking blue. In our modern world, we've been conditioned to see blue as the boy color, the shade of corporate suits and nursery wallpapers. But here, it was the ultimate symbol of feminine grace and mystery, painted with crushed, semi-precious lapis lazuli that cost more than its weight in gold. It's a strange feeling when you realize that our most natural instincts about gender, that girls wear red and boys wear blue, are actually a total historical 180. We're living in a world where the colors have been completely swapped and almost no one noticed the moment it happened. How did the color of conquest and emperors become the color of a cocktail dress? And why did the most expensive feminine jewel tone in history end up as the default uniform for the modern working man? The answer isn't just about fashion, it's about a shift in how we see power, sex, and the way a single wavelength of light can manipulate the human brain.
That phenomenon you described in the gallery,
Yeah.
That's precisely why we're doing this deep dive. Our mission here is really to trace this complete historical inversion of color symbolism. We're going to look at how our contemporary, culturally enforced understanding, blue for boys, red for girls, is less than 150 years old.
So it's incredibly recent in the grand scheme of things.
Oh, incredibly. And it's basically a profound accident of economics and industrial chemistry. For vast stretches of history, power, and particularly masculine patriarchal authority was signaled exclusively by deep reds and purples.
Why those colors specifically?
Simply because the pigments were catastrophically expensive to source. That's the whole story. And conversely, the single most prized and valuable color in the entire Western artistic tradition was a blue reserved strictly for the highest status feminine figure, the Virgin Mary. So we are tracing how shifts in power, political, economic, and then eventually the shift to pure sexual signaling led to this massive cultural swap right under our noses.
Okay, let's unpack this. The foundation of this whole story, it sounds like, is just brutal economic scarcity. If you wanted to project power, you had to wear colors that were literally harder to get than precious metals. Let's start with those colors of conquest.
Right. So when we examine the ancient world, especially these colossal powers like Rome and Imperial China, the colors red and its derivative purple were not just status symbols. They were markers of legal exclusion, of a government-enforced monopoly.
Let's focus on Rome first, because the depth of the obsession with purple, what we call Tyrian purple, is just staggering.
It truly is. Tyrian purple, or royal purple, it really sets the benchmark for exclusivity. This was a deep, intense crimson purple dye, and the source was the secretions of thousands upon thousands of sea snails.
Sea snails, that just sounds so bizarre.
It is. Specifically, species of the Murex genus. And to produce just a single ounce of the raw dye, you might need to crush over 250,000 snails.
250,000 snails for a tiny amount of dye. The labor alone must have been immense.
Immense, expensive, and famously pungent. The stench of the dye works was legendary in antiquity.
I remember reading somewhere that a single garment dyed with genuine Tyrian purple could literally cost more than a senator's entire estate. Is that true?
That is absolutely accurate. It was the ultimate currency of color. And because of this prohibitive cost, it was legally and culturally reserved only for the ruling elite. That cemented its association with absolute, unchallenged masculine authority. Wearing Tyrian purple was a visible declaration that you were above the law, above the economy of the common person.
And this masculine power, it wasn't just for politicians in the Senate. It extended to the military, tying red directly to aggressive conquest.
Absolutely. The Roman military used reds extensively to signal war and masculinity. Your average Roman soldier wore a red or crimson tunic. But the status difference was clear when you looked at the officers.
Ah, so there were shades of power even within the red.
Exactly. Men of higher rank wore even deeper, more costly shades of crimson or scarlet cloaks. These were known as the plutamentum. And this wasn't just practical, it was deeply symbolic. Red was fundamentally associated with Mars, the god of war, aggression, and, the spilling of blood necessary for the empire.
That distinction between the common soldier's red and the officer's deeper crimson really highlights how color, even within the same shade, could just segment status so precisely.
And the pinnacle of this aggressive scarlet authority was the Roman triumph. This is where it gets really intense. We know that when a Roman general returned victorious and was granted this highest honor, the celebratory ritual demanded that his entire body was painted red.
Wait, not just his clothes, his actual body.
His entire body. That detail is just chillingly powerful. We're not talking about simply wearing a dyed cloth. We're talking about transforming a man into a living embodiment of the god Mars.
A crimson statue of conquest and victory.
It was a literal, full-body declaration of power. It marked him as temporarily divine and fully consecrated to the aggressive force of the state. It just underscores this profound link between red, blood, war, and the absolute peak of Roman masculinity.
So beyond the military and that incredible ritual, how did this scarcity play out with the political class, the senators?
Through the toga praetexta. Now, the toga itself was the uniform of the citizen, but the toga praetexta was different. It was worn by magistrates, priests, and crucially senators.
And how was it different?
It was a white wool toga, distinguished by a purple stripe, or a hem, just a stripe.
So even a small amount of that color was enough to signal everything.
That subtle purple stripe clearly defined status. It set strict legal boundaries against usurpation. The color was a visible sign of the law itself, enforcing who had the power to rule and who did not.
And if we dig into the pigments themselves, the cost of that red was often paid in human lives, not just in, sea snails.
Precisely. We have to also consider the brilliant, vibrant red pigment used for frescoes and paintings. Vermilion. Vermilion is derived from cinnabar, which is mercury ore.
Mercury, so it was incredibly toxic.
Lethal. While it provided an incredible lasting brightness, you can still see its intensity on the walls of Pompeii. The extraction process was a death sentence.
I think we sometimes forget that the brilliance of ancient color often came with profound danger.
It really did. The primary source for the Romans was a massive complex of mines in Almaden, Spain. Working in the cinnabar mines was considered a virtual death sentence due to acute mercury poisoning. The miners were almost exclusively slaves or prisoners.
So sending someone to the mines was a form of execution.
It was. For Rome, it was seen as a punishment akin to death. The very preciousness of that bright, commanding red was derived directly from immense human suffering and toxicity, cementing its status as a color only the most powerful could command.
It sounds like red and purple really established themselves as symbols of the patriarchal state through both extreme economic scarcity and human cost in the West. But you mentioned Imperial China. Did they share the same aggressive masculine coding for red, or did it evolve differently?
The parallel is striking, truly, but it has this unique Eastern cosmological framework overlaid on top of it. Red held immense status in Eastern hierarchies, not just as a symbol of power, but as a force of nature itself.
A force of nature. Walk us through that framework.
So in Chinese philosophy, the cosmos and the human world are interconnected through 5 fundamental elements. You have metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. Red was fundamentally and powerfully associated with the element of fire.
Fire, which symbolizes energy, brilliance.
Exactly. And transformation. That gives the color an immediate inherent power that goes beyond just wealth.
So the emperors weren't just picking a color they liked.
Not at all. They often chose a color they believed would bring the most auspicious fortune and prosperity to their reign. They were trying to align the imperial house with the cosmic force, with fire. And red was a frequent and enduring choice for the seat of power across multiple dynasties.
And this noble color was then integrated deeply into the fabric of court life, I assume.
Oh, absolutely. We see red employed extensively in all court ceremonies, including coronations and, very significantly, weddings. This is true across centuries of major dynasties: the Zhou, Han, Jin, Song, and Ming. It was a core pillar of imperial identity. It signified both nobility and good fortune.
So, just like in Rome, red was used to enforce a strict bureaucratic hierarchy.
Precisely. If we look specifically at the Song dynasty, which ran from about the 10th to the 13th centuries, the strictness was visible in every court functionary. Officials of the middle ranks, the 4th and 5th grades, they wore bright red clothing. But the highest ranks, those closest to the emperor, the top 3, those were reserved for purple.
So again, purple represents the absolute apex of political achievement. even more potent than red.
It was the ultimate ambition, and this gave rise to a wonderful cultural idiom that really captures the entire system. The ambition of a talented official was captured in the phrase, "He is so red he becomes purple."
Wow. That's a perfect visual metaphor for rising through the ranks, ascending from a high, visible status, red, to the ultimate supreme color of the inner circle, purple.
It says it all.
And this political dominance wasn't just on their clothes, it was quite literally stamped onto the built environment.
Yes, imperial Chinese architecture used red relentlessly to project power and longevity. During the Tang and Song dynasties, palace gates were invariably painted red. And then later, when the king rulers established the Forbidden City in Beijing, all the critical structures, the walls, the monumental gates, the support beams, the pillars, they were all painted in a combination of vibrant red and gold.
So there was no ambiguity.
None. Red was unequivocally the color of male governance, military success, absolute authority, and cosmic fortune across these foundational ancient civilizations.
What stands out to me is that the scarcity of the materials, whether it was the toxic cinnabar or the rare snails, it artificially locked red and purple into this position of masculine political power. It wasn't really an aesthetic choice. It was an economic necessity for signaling who was in charge.
And that economic scarcity is the great dictator of color symbolism. And while red was dominating the political and military spectrum in both the East and the West, blue was ascending in a completely different sacred domain. It was equally defined by its impossible scarcity, but it was tied to the ultimate expression of the feminine divine.
Okay, so we shift from the color of the emperor and the general to the color of the goddess. Blue, in our current context, is the color of standardized, cheap utility, like blue jeans or something. But historically, it was anything but.
Right. We're moving into the realm of ultramarine or Marian blue.
Yeah.
For centuries, this was the most expensive color in Western art, and its story illustrates why blue was initially coded as a color of immense spiritual status and high-status femininity.
What made this specific blue so much more valuable than even that infamous Tyrian purple?
The sourcing. It all came down to the sourcing. The pigment was derived from grinding a semi-precious stone, Lapis Lazuli. And, crucially, the stone came from a single geographically challenging source mines located deep in the mountains of northeastern Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, so the distance alone must have been staggering.
It was the Silk Road of color. The raw material had to be mined, processed crudely, transported thousands of miles, often through perilous mountain passes and across oceans before finally reaching European markets. This logistical chain meant that in medieval and Renaissance Europe, the raw ultramarine pigment was demonstrably of greater value than gold.
More valuable than gold.
Yes, you could literally trade an ounce of the blue powder for an ounce of pure gold.
That is truly mind-boggling. So when you look at Renaissance art, you are literally seeing sections of the canvas that were painted with a king's ransom. The name itself reflects that, doesn't it? Ultramarine.
It does. Its Italian name, blue ultramare, means blue beyond the sea. It was a color that embodied distance, rarity, and insurmountable cost. A patron commissioning a major work of art faced a massive financial choice. Could they or could they not afford the blue sections?
And that decision of where to use this immensely costly substance, that's what cemented its symbolic meaning.
Absolutely. Because of its expense, ultramarine was reserved for the highest expression of reverence and devotion in painting. It wasn't used casually for background skies or something simple. In fact, many contracts stipulated that the artist was only allowed to use the highest quality ultramarine for the robes of the Virgin Mary.
And they had to use cheaper blues for other figures.
Yes, lesser, cheaper blues like azurite for other figures or less important parts of the painting.
So patrons weren't just paying for the art. They were specifically expected to fund the purchase of the lapis lazuli used in the work, almost like a separate donation.
Exactly. And the figure who received this ultimate glorification was the Virgin Mary. Swathing her in robes of this brilliant, costly ultramarine became the ultimate visible expression of devotion and glorification. It was a reflection of her rising status in Christianity.
And where did this tradition of painting Mary in blue even begin?
It originated in the Byzantine Empire, around 500 AD. In Byzantine court culture, blue already carried the distinction of being the color of an empress. It symbolized nobility and purity. So as the Virgin Mary became increasingly central to worship in the West, this imperial association just transferred over to her, mirroring her spiritual authority.
That means for centuries, blue carried the weight of intense wealth and spiritual high-status femininity. It's the polar opposite of the military red we were just talking about.
And the artists, they use this contrast deliberately. In many major religious works, the deep, costly blue associated with Mary was intentionally juxtaposed with the intense red associated with Jesus.
Right, the red symbolizing sacrifice, blood, the redemption narrative.
The colors created a perfect symbolic harmony. The most expensive color for the divine feminine, and the most aggressive primal color for the sacred masculine.
But I wonder, for the average person in the 14th or 15th century who could never afford to own anything blue or even see a painting that used ultramarine outside of a cathedral, how did that scarcity influence their view of blue? Did they just associate it with women because of Mary?
They certainly associated it with the highest form of holiness and status, which in a sacred context was channeled through the feminine figure of Mary. The cult of the Virgin Mary was so powerful that by the 14th century, it did indeed make blue fashionable among the wealthy elite who could afford cheaper substitutes or access limited supplies. And that's what solidified blue's early association with feminine grace and status.
Okay, that helps anchor the initial gender coding. Blue equals high status, sacred feminine. Red equals exclusive, conquering, political masculine. But to understand the complete swap, we need to understand the cultural narratives that defined which gender was fit for power in the first place, regardless of the cost of the dye.
That's our next pivot. We move from the economics of color scarcity to the cultural narratives of power. Specifically, how Roman society defined masculinity as successful empire building and femininity as inherent vulnerability and failure, using the story of Dido and Aeneas as the ultimate cautionary tale.
This sounds like we are setting the stage for why red was culturally required to remain exclusively masculine. If the Roman worldview dictated that women were incapable of sustaining power, then their most aggressive, powerful colors could never be associated with the feminine.
That is the core argument. Virgil's Aeneid, which was written to glorify the foundation of the Roman state, it established a powerful gender dichotomy that defined Roman political success. Our sources emphasize that Roman colonial attitudes were, quote, increasingly male-oriented.
And how did that translate into defining imperialism itself? What does that mean?
It meant that conquest, the very mechanism of empire, was viewed through the lens of phallocentric dominance. Imperialism, the aggressive extension of power, the penetration and subjugation of new territory, was framed as an inherently masculine venture. The sexual dynamics of Roman society were just overlaid directly onto their imperial policy. The state was the aggressive, penetrating force.
So if Rome and its foundational hero, Aeneas, represented this conquering masculine ideal, where did Virgil place Dido and her new state of Carthage?
Well, Dido, the queen of Carthage, and her colony were coded as the feminine receptive entity, inherently vulnerable to male imperial force. Dido's initial attempts at colonization, while successful, were defined by feminine traits, which the Romans ultimately viewed as fragile.
She acquired land by strategy, right? The famous story about cutting the oxide into strips to encompass the most territory.
Exactly. She acquired land through clever trickery and negotiation, not through military might. And her focus was inward. City building, cultivating trade, nourishing a growing population within the city walls. This was all coded as feminine, a protective womb nurturing development.
As opposed to the aggressive outward military expansion that defined Roman masculinity.
Right. She was successful, but only until true masculine colonialism arrived on her shores.
And her failure is directly linked to her shift away from this initial competent leadership.
Absolutely. Virgil deliberately frames Dido's downfall in this deeply gendered light. Her political competence, which required traits that were coded as masculine like focus, sobriety, leadership, it all collapses the moment she is overcome by passion for Aeneas. She transitions into a figure defined by feminine hysteria and irrational sensuality.
She stops the city building. She subordinates her whole political mission to her personal desire.
She does. The text emphasizes that she shifts her attention from the serious masculine work of empire building to desiring the joy of children, all the gifts of love. The standard trappings of traditional womanhood, which in this Roman cautionary tale signify political weakness and unfitness to rule. This emotional failure is what ultimately destroys her and her city.
And this is where the color symbolism dramatically re-enters the narrative, right? It signifies the moment of imperial subjugation.
It's a visually encoded transfer of power. It's brilliant. When Aeneas is found by the messenger Mercury in Carthage, he has already accepted Dido's offer of power and is essentially taking charge of the building project.
He's usurping her authority over this feminized space.
Completely. Dido's role has been relegated to subordinate domestic support.
And that subordination is symbolized by the garment she is weaving for him.
Precisely. Dido is explicitly seen weaving Aeneas a cloak of glowing Tyrian purple, the supreme color of male political and military power. This garment, a product of feminine labor gifted to the masculine hero, it symbolizes the imperial takeover. Dido is no longer a political equal. She is reduced to a wifely figure, making the ceremonial uniform for the conquering male. By handing over the purple, she is handing over the sovereignty of the city.
It really recontextualizes the whole story. It's not just a sad love affair. It's a political manifesto disguised as an epic poem.
It is entirely that. Virgil's narrative of Dido's tragic suicide and the spectacular failure of her colonial venture serves as a profound commentary on the inherent superiority of Roman masculine imperialism. It's a deliberate what not to do for empire building. It demonstrates that a female colonial venture, no matter how clever or prosperous initially, is intrinsically fragile and will be easily overpowered by the inherent aggressive force of masculine endeavor.
And for the Roman audience, this foretold their own history, linking the color purple to this unstoppable male destiny.
Yes. Dido's death and Carthage's subsequent obliteration by Rome were historical facts to Virgil's readers. The message was culturally reinforced. Red and purple were safe only in the hands of the conquering masculine power. This cultural coding, layered on top of the immense economic scarcity, held for thousands of years. But then, the scarcity model broke.
Okay, this is the pivot moment we've been waiting for. We've established that for millennia, red and purple meant exclusive, gold-like patriarchal power. So what chemical and economic cataclysm broke that entire system and allowed red to migrate from the cardinal's robe to the lipstick tube?
The great spoiler was the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
Specifically, the rise of synthetic chemistry in the mid-19th century. Once you eliminate the scarcity of pigments, the political meaning just collapses.
So let's look at red first. What replaced Tyrian purple and that toxic cinnabar?
Well, there were two major advances. First, around the 16th and 17th centuries, better access to cochineal, a brilliant red dye from insects in the Americas, began to lower the price barrier a little bit. But the true collapse came in the 1850s with aniline dyes, particularly magenta and mauve.
Aniline dyes, those were the cheap synthetic replacements, weren't they?
They were revolutionary. Suddenly, chemists could synthesize brilliant, fast, complex colors, including intense reds and vibrant purples from coal tar derivatives. These dyes were cheap, they were stable, and they could be produced in immense industrial quantities. The economic barrier that had guarded red and purple for 3,000 years simply dissolved overnight.
So that meant the symbol of the emperor, that commanding crimson, was now affordable to a working-class woman for a scarf or a dress.
Exactly. And stripped of its status as a gold-like commodity and a political monopoly, red was free to migrate to a new functional domain, the realm of primal, biological, and social signaling. It was no longer a marker of patriarchal power. It became a cue for sexual attractiveness.
And this transition into a primarily feminine sexual signal is what modern sociology calls the red effect.
Yes, and it has been extensively documented. You look at cross-cultural psychological studies from America, Europe, China. The findings are remarkably consistent.
And what are they?
That men perceive women associated with red, whether through clothing, lipstick, or even just a red background, as significantly more sexually attractive, more desirable and approachable.
Let's delve into the actual studies here. How did they test this effect in a controlled way?
The experimental design is often quite simple, but very effective. Researchers might present male participants with the same photograph of a woman, but they'll manipulate the color of her shirt, for example.
So digitally changing a gray shirt to a red one in the photo.
Exactly, or changing the background color. And in things like speed dating scenarios or observational studies, men consistently rate the target in red as more desirable and are quicker to start a conversation.
And the effects aren't just subjective ratings, they translate into actual measurable behavioral shifts. Right.
Oh, absolutely. The effect is behavioral and actionable. Studies have shown that men are statistically more likely to offer help to women wearing red. They ask more intimate sort of mating-related questions during conversation.
Wow.
And perhaps most tangibly, male customers tend to tip waitresses more generously when the woman is wearing red lipstick or a red uniform component.
It's just amazing that a color can exert such a consistent, unconscious influence. What is the working hypothesis for why red, specifically, is so effective?
It's hypothesized to be a dual mechanism, a strong partnership between evolutionary hardwiring, and deep social learning.
Okay, start with the evolutionary argument. How far back does this cue go?
Well, for this we look to our primate heritage. For many species of female primates like chimpanzees and baboons, physiological changes linked to heightened sexual receptivity like estrus are often signaled by very distinct genital reddening and swelling.
A clear visual signal.
An unambiguous visual cue. It signals peak reproductive value and opportunity to males. The theory is that this ancient basic mechanism of association red equals sexual opportunity remains deeply embedded in the human male brain, operating way beneath conscious thought.
So that suggests an unconscious biological trigger. How does the social component reinforce this?
Social learning takes that biological trigger and gives it cultural resonance and a more generalized meaning. Across long-standing civilizations, red has been universally associated with romance, passion, lust, fertility, and even danger. In China, red face is a traditional term for a young, beautiful girl. Traditional weddings are just drenched in red to symbolize auspiciousness and fertility. These cultural norms amplify and generalize the basic biological meaning, forming a potent, implicit association between red and sexuality in the modern mind.
So if the effect is both biological and cultural, how do researchers determine which mechanism is stronger? This leads us to a critical finding about facial sexual dimorphism, right?
This is the key piece of evidence, and it really tilts the balance toward the evolutionary argument. Researchers found that the enhancing effect of red on sexual attraction for men is moderated by the woman's existing facial sexual dimorphism.
That's a highly technical term. Let's break down what facial sexual dimorphism actually means in this context.
In short, it refers to the physical differences between male and female faces that are determined by sex hormones, primarily estrogen in women. So, high femininity in a woman's face, characteristics like softer jawlines, fuller lips, more prominent cheekbones. These are linked to higher estrogen exposure during puberty and have historically been associated with higher fertility and reproductive value.
And the finding was that red only works when those underlying traits are present.
Precisely. Red significantly boosts the attractiveness rating of women who already possess highly feminine facial characteristics. But the critical finding is this. Red has virtually no effect on women who possess more masculine facial characteristics.
That completely refutes the idea that red is purely a social construct, like just seeing a cultural symbol of romance.
Absolutely. If the effect were purely social, if it were just a cultural schema, like activating the idea of passion, then red should boost the attractiveness of everyone equally, regardless of their jaw structure or cheekbones. But the fact that the signal is canceled out, if the physical cues, the masculine traits, contradict the fertility message, that strongly suggests the effect is tied to reproductive fitness assessment.
So red acts as a supplementary signal. It's an amplifier.
It's an amplifier, not a magic charm. It enhances an already established signal of peak fertility, but it loses its power if the target's underlying physical traits signal relatively low reproductive value.
So the color is working in partnership with existing biology.
That's the consensus interpretation. Red enhances the signal of reproductive health and opportunity. It's a prime example of a color shifting from signaling external patriarchal political status, like a costly cloak, to signaling internal biological status, like sexual availability.
But before we conclude, the studies also mentioned a generalized positive correlation for red beyond just the sexual sphere.
They did. And this is interesting. While the sexual attraction effect is specialized and moderated by dimorphism, male participants also rated female targets wearing red as generally warmer and more competent. This suggests that red still carries a generalized positive cultural connotation, a halo effect that goes beyond strict sexual interest. Perhaps this is residual power from its history as an auspicious, noble color, especially prominent in Asian cultures where red still maintains strong ties to fortune and success.
So we've traced a complete 180-degree swap. Red has gone from the color of the conquering Roman general, worn by men to signify absolute crushing political power, to a tool used predominantly by women to signal fertility and sexual desirability in the modern era. Meanwhile, blue has transitioned from the priceless sacred color of the divine feminine to the ubiquitous uniform of the modern man.
The historical distance is immense, and the cause is entirely economic. The colors of antiquity, Tyrian red and purple, ultramarine blue, they were power-bound specifically because of their extreme gold-like economic value and geographical scarcity. That value dictated who was legally, politically, or religiously permitted to wear them and what high-status message they conveyed.
Red was masculine political power because it was rare, aggressive, and toxic to acquire. Blue was sacred feminine power because it was impossibly rare, beautiful, and came from beyond the sea.
And the defining moment was industrialization and synthetic chemistry. The economic barrier dissolved. Prussian blue arrived in the 1700s. Then the aniline dyes created cheap, vibrant purples and reds in the 1800s. The chemical process made the colors of emperors and goddesses cheap and available to the masses.
And once that scarcity was gone, the entire cultural framework of color symbolism collapsed and reformed.
Precisely. Red, stripped of its patriarchal status marker, migrated immediately into the domain of primal, biological signaling, and female sexuality. It was accessible, it was vibrant, and it served an unconscious, universal signaling role.
And blue had the opposite journey. It had to lose its sacred exclusivity before it could gain its modern, functional dominance.
And that's the unspoken half of the swap. Once cheap, stable blue pigments became industrially available, and this happened long before synthetic red's blue was quickly adopted for purposes requiring durability and standardization.
Like military uniforms.
Exactly. Think about the military. By the time of World War I and World War II, militaries were using cheap indigo-based dyes for countless uniforms, establishing blue and dark navy as the color of standardized, functional, disciplined, male collective identity.
So the functionalism of blue replaced the spiritual value of ultramarine.
It became the color of sobriety, of duty, of professional uniformity. And this paved the way for the modern corporate suit. The suit, the uniform of the standardized, sober, working man, almost invariably adopted shades of blue or gray. Blue went from the color that literally cost more than gold to the color that symbolizes being a dependable, standardized component of the industrial economy. It became the default uniform for the modern, professionalized man completing the historical inversion.
The colors of power didn't change what they meant to the people, they just changed who could afford to wear them, and then industrialization dictated who got stuck with the tab. We are now living in a world where we are wearing our history completely backwards, dictated by an 1850s chemical formula.